See me. Awesome. Hi, Ashira. Congrats, by the way. I think this is the first time I've seen you live. Okay, great. Everybody can hear me. You're welcome. Um, I really wanted to play our theme song, but I'm having issues this morning. Anyway, imagine right now there's a kind of a techno rave style hydrogen song playing in the background, talking about hydrogen in the sky and hydrogen powered aircraft. It was made with AI. It's a really cool song, but it's not letting me pull it up right now. So you'll just have to listen to me talk. So yeah, I'm so excited to be here with you all today. We've got a really great speaker, just a couple of quick announcements. And I'll also open it up for if anybody else wants to announce an event or any news or just wants to share something. Um, the biggest update for us right now is we just finished the hydrogen safety course, which was extremely insightful. And in April, I think April 14th, don't quote me on the date, but we are launching the policy in power, how to make governments prioritize hydrogen aviation. Um, Now, whether you have any experience with policy or zero, like me, um, I made this course because I noticed that there was a gap. Like often we see aviation kind of a footnote in energy projects, like the DOE hydrogen stuff. Maybe aviation will get a sentence, and it's usually with respect to producing SAF. And then in aviation, especially like advanced air mobility and the new act, I can't think of the name, but the stuff that is advancing new aircraft and novel aircraft, hydrogen will get a couple sentences. But hydrogen aviation doesn't have its own lane, and so we're kind of forgotten about. And so that's what we identified as the biggest gap, even bigger than technological advances and things like that. And so I really wanted to know, like, how do you change this? And so we're doing a course. It's 3 weeks, but it's really more than a course. There's going to be a capstone project. Every person that attends is going to contact their representative. So as a group, we are together going to learn how to find them, learn who we should talk to, learn what to say, have a unified message, and then we're actually going to do it. We'll do a pitch like internally first, so and get kind of graded by people that work in policy. And this course is going to be the catalyst that really creates momentum. I think it'll be the first time in the United States that we see a large group of people with a shared vision. So I encourage you, and I'll stick a link to that course. I'll just be mindful that um, the course that it says on here, it's not going to be until 2 weeks later. Like the date is pushed back like 2 weeks. So I think it'll say like April 7th or something. So let me just grab that link. And while I'm looking for that link, does anybody want to share? No, I'm not sharing. I'm just talking, Mike. I should share, but I was struggling with that song and I didn't have anything pulled up properly. But I will go ahead and share it. Um, I don't know why everything's just going really slow for me. And also, I'm getting over COVID, so if I sound yucky still, excuse that. Sorry, I had to do it. So, but you could share if you have an upcoming event. Ashira, you could, if you want to turn your mic on, you're welcome to get on camera as well. You can talk about conferences that you guys have coming up. Mike, if you want to share anything coming up, or tell us how amazing Verticon was and that I missed out, or anybody else, not just people I'm calling on, but if you know of an event related to eVTOL, electric aviation, hydrogen, just jump in and talk while I'm pulling some stuff up.
Okay. So I have a couple to share. So I'll just pop on and say hi.
Oh,
Hi.
do you want to tell everybody who you are in case they don't know? I think most of us know you, but just in case.
Hi there. I'm Ashira Butler-Green. I'm Senior Manager of Aeronautics at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIAA. and an increasingly enthusiastic member of the hydrogen community, with many thanks to Danielle, Mike, and today's speaker, Phil Ansell, who we are happy to host. I don't know, Phil, how you would describe it. I hope that we give you a comfortable home at AIAA to work on sustainable aviation and hydrogen design for aircraft. So, all of that being said, announcements,
Yes.
things that are happening. One, the Chehalis Regional Airport just sent out a request for information for hydrogen operations. Danielle, I don't know if that's come your way yet.
I
AIAA
don't
is
know.
preparing a response for this.
Okay, thank you.
It's due pretty quickly. It's due April 3rd. So
Okay.
maybe this is something, I'll send it to you offline. Maybe this is something that your course could touch and talk about, even if you don't prepare a response.
Yes.
But it's a really good introduction because it's pretty thorough. They spell out what it is an RFI is and how to respond to it.
Oh, very cool.
So I think it's a pretty good artifact, and the fact that it's hydrogen focused. So that's one thing.
Hmm.
Second thing is that aviation is coming up, and we have a lot of hydrogen activity. Phil, I don't want to steal any thunder from you to talk about what you have planned as far as sustainability, but we have and the larger committee activities there. But there's a lot. There's a lot there. Danielle, I don't know if you all are committed to teaching hydrogen again. We're working on a sustainable aviation fuels course with you all that we're thrilled about. Mikhail, you were probably wondering who is this random woman putting a like on my Sweden note. The reason is that I'm co-organizing a session on decision making and emerging aviation technologies at the Regional Studies Association annual conference in Gothenburg in June, the week after aviation. And so I will be in town. I'm not specifically speaking about energy there. I'm speaking about advanced air mobility, but we have people from Cranfield and Cambridge talking about alternative energy pathways and decarbonization and decision making and all that. Thank you for letting me have spotlight. I will happily hop off now, but I
Yes.
am here and yeah, look forward to chatting.
Awesome. It's good to see you back. We missed you. And yeah, we're gonna do the so what Ashira was talking about. So High Sky, we've done some courses internally that a lot of you are familiar with, but we've also done courses with AIAA. And one that we did that was great was hydrogen aircraft design. That's not the official name; it's a longer name, but I don't remember the entire name. And so Ashira, to answer your question, we're gonna do that every other year. So I think the way it will work is like 2026 will be SAF, and then 2027 will be hydrogen aircraft design again. And then we can like alternate them like that since we didn't have. Thank you for finding that link. Um, okay, Mike, did you have anything you wanted to share or anybody else?
Yeah, I was having some technical difficulties with my camera. Yeah, so importantly at Aviation, AIAA Aviation will be the uh, VFS AIAA Hydrogen Aviation Symposium, H2 Aero, that Jesse Schneider is a lead for organizing, and so that's the second week in June. The first week of June is the SAE Aerotech, which has the International Powered Lift Conference. There's nothing particularly hydrogen related there, but that's some vertical flight and advanced air mobility talks. And then I'm excited to be organizing I'm a co-organizer of the 20th Annual Electric Aircraft Symposium. That's all electric aviation, vertical and horizontal takeoff and landing. We don't have anything planned yet for hydrogen, but I'm sure we'll have at least a couple talks related to hydrogen. That's in July, the weekend before Oshkosh, EAA Air Venture. It's also the weekend before Farnborough, so if you're going there, you can still make the Electric Aircraft Symposium. I'll put a couple links into the chat, and you guys can check them out and see if they're interesting. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. And also, just really quick, I want to remind folks, I I'm having router issues today, so forgive me, but I wish I could pull up links. Let me see if this will load. Okay, cool, it will. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly to let you all know. Also, Mike, I'm going to make you a co-host if that's okay, because I don't have to like accidentally ignore people in the lobby. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. We're in the free members hub, and I'm having internet issues today, but what I want to point out is we have this event. This is totally free for everybody, and I don't know why it's not loading. This has been my entire morning. But when you're in here and you go to events, a really cool list of events will show up, and it's free for anybody to post an event in there. So we have over 500 people that are looking at this. So any event posted in there, we don't care. We don't if you're advancing hydrogen aviation or electric aviation, we consider that for the greater good. So feel free to advertise what you want in there. Okay, and let's see. I will stop my share, and then gosh, it's all different. Forgive me. Okay, gotta find it. And then let's get into our exciting speaker for today. So many of you also probably know Dr. Phillip J. Ansell, and he's an associate professor and Alan Ormsby Faculty Scholar in the Department of Aerospace Engineering at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's the director of the Center for Sustainable Aviation, CSA, at Illinois, and the director of the Center for High Efficiency Electrical Technologies for Aircraft, or CHEETAH. He's an AIAA Associate Fellow and Chair of the AIAA Sustainability Integration and Outreach Committee. In recognition for his efforts, he's been granted the AIAA Lawrence Sperry Award, Young Investigator Awards from the Army Research Office, and Air Force Office of Scientific Research. He was also previously named on the Forbes 30 under 30 list in the science category. Professor Ansell earned his PhD in 2013 and a master's in aerospace engineering in 2010 from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And his bachelor's is, like many of us, aerospace engineering from Penn State. And without further ado, I would love to welcome Phil to the stage. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. You can put your questions in the chat, but let's not ask them until we get to the end. We used to let people just kind of interrupt and ask questions, but then sometimes the conversations get derailed and we don't get through the presentation. So we'll go through the entire presentation, and then I'll call you on to ask your questions at the end. So feel free to ask them in the chat as we go. Without further ado, Phil, the stage is all yours.
All right. Thanks, Danielle. Really exciting to be here. Appreciate the invitation and just, yeah, what a pleasure it is to be able to continue to meet with you all and discuss exciting developments. This talk today is going to be a lot different than maybe what some of you are expecting, which might be good or bad. But nevertheless, it's always a good time to share stories and kind of learn from each other across this community. So really appreciate the time here. And appreciate too on the ground rules because I'm totally a victim of nerd sniping. I will take any question and just roll with it for the next 2 hours and we don't have all day for that. So, but what I'm going to talk about today is what I'm calling a blueprint for hydrogen aviation integration for the year 2050. The idea here being, let's take a look at, not necessarily at the technological developments, but rather some of the other boundary conditions around development of hydrogen as an ecosystem and how, the aviation sector might dovetail on developments happening even outside of aviation in the broader energy landscape. To answer some really pivotal questions about by the year 2050, what types of aircraft should we expect to be in service that operate on hydrogen? how about things like, how much hydrogen is being produced and how much does it cost? And, is that palatable enough for the needs and demands of the aviation sector? So this is my kind of crystal ball approach to say what developments really need to happen as necessary conditions for this to 2050 point to be kind of the tipping point for commercial transportation applications of hydrogen. And just I'd be remiss if I didn't say, we've been in this. This is one of the things that we do within kind of the work in hydrogen and aircraft technologies. So Cheetah, as you can see, is here. So we do work. This is just kind of a brief background of some other things that my team does at the University of Illinois. Kind of looking at the landscape of hydrogen technologies and how it integrates into aircraft systems. We look at bigger life cycle elements here, and this is some kind of, more about what you'll see today is how, is on the production and supply side, what developments are necessary if we can reconcile the whole complex system of systems that surrounds, the fuel system side. We also do a lot of aircraft design using model-based design and optimization, whether it be hybrid electric, whether it be hydrogen hybrid electric, which we'll talk about later, as well as I have a passion and background in aerodynamics, so wind tunnel testing, aircraft design, those types of things. And the work that I'm going to be talking about today, as I mentioned, is a little bit atypical for work that we present within my research team. So just to keep you all informed, we are continuing to do work on Cheetah. So I saw Andy was in the audience today. So glad that I was able to, show off some of the work that's ongoing there, whether it be to test hydrogen fuel cell systems on UAVs, or whether it be to develop, for instance, kind of advanced cryogenic electric machines that can offer, dramatic improvements in specific power and efficiency to all the way to actually building prototypes of liquid hydrogen tanks. These are things that we have ongoing under that program. We're also in the midst of working on this program, also supported by NASA, called ACES, and we're working that with Jet Zero, Zero Avia, and a small group, SHZ. And here we're looking at for even the hardest to abate sectors of long haul wide body classes of aircraft. What kinds of technologies can we integrate into, how do we marry hydrogen technologies with blended wing body aircraft technologies? And we're cooking up some really interesting stuff. You'll be hearing more about it. So one of the things that was indicated was ongoing things for the summer conferences. So there's some work that we'll be presenting at AIAA Aviation. And there's going to be more things that will be coming down the pipeline here into the future. And last but not least, on the propulsion technology side, we have an ongoing program related to hydrogen hybrid aircraft components and systems, where we're looking at not hybrid fuel cell battery systems, but rather fuel cell plus battery for electric power system, but as coupled within the core of a gas turbine engine. And the hybridization approach here is perhaps not what you typically think. We're not taking fuel cell power and boosting the fan spool, but rather we're actually using it as a means to improve the adaptability of some of the core technologies. So, allowing independent control of the overall pressure ratio as well as the mass flow through the core allows us to actually make the gas turbine engine functionally operate much more strategically across an entire mission duration. So more on that to come, also, incidentally, at AIAA Aviation. But I'm going to jump into what we're going to talk about today. So today's talk, this is all based on kind of some work that I had my arm twisted to do by one of the editors of this journal, Progress in Aerospace Sciences. It's a great journal. This article is available in open access form, so anyone can go in and download it. It's available. Feel free to pick it up, and there's more details in there under the hood of kind of all of what this work entailed. And my disclaimer here, and I put this just because, again, I said that this is like my crystal ball approach of trying to take this complex system of systems and project, what is within the art of the possible around a scenario for hydrogen aviation by the year 2050. Not to say that we have figured everything out, not to say that we have reached, kind of this precipice where we have, ultimately decarbonize the entire sector, but rather, what is maybe a bullish but practical and technically credible view of what might be the case by that time frame. That being said, I put this disclaimer in because I don't want anyone to go out there and start buying stock or do investments or all that kind of wacky thing, right? Just based on one guy's kind of interpretation about what's possible. So really the work is intended to be focused on what can happen in the future, you know, to show that there is enough money in the world, that there is enough cases where we have enough land area for power production, to show that, if we do concerted and committed developments across a whole breadth of stakeholders, this is something that is possible, right? So it's really a work that focuses on what can happen in the future, not what will happen. All the more important why, whenever Danielle kind of mentioned at the top end here, getting involved and engaged within policy and having kind of a unified voice. There's a policy arm that, of course, is going to be very important to this long-term and purposeful commitment. So anyway, go ahead and mobilize and do that. But disclaimer with that outside of, with that being said, really, the point of this talk is to say that aviation, by principle, is an evolutionary industry. So, all that being said, we have undergone many, many different changes as a sector across the initial pioneer era all the way to kind of our current globalization age, where we've changed the energy carriers, we've changed the propulsion and power technologies, we've changed the materials that have been utilized. And really, our goal should be, as we approach kind of this future era, to term this and create what I'm calling here the sustainability age, where, our energy sources, we made a transition initially from gasoline engines to kerosene, largely owing to the fact that, gasoline likes to freeze at altitudes of 37,000 feet. Kerosene allows us, much higher and high speed flight. As we look towards the future, though, going towards hydrogen and electric is really what we should be aiming to do alongside other developments across the aircraft technology and landscape. So I get the question a lot, why hydrogen, right? And I've, don't really need to spend a whole lot of time with this audience. A lot of you probably see this type of plot here that shows the specific energy on the y-axis and energy density on the x-axis, or vice versa. Really just to answer the question of what is it that we need out of, let's say, current aircraft energy carriers. So right now, Jet A is here. And of course, liquid hydrogen offers tremendous improvements in the specific energy or the gravimetric efficiency of the energy carrier. We, of course, do have to sacrifice the energy density. So, of course, we end up with these high volume platforms. And there's, of course, a wealth of other options on here. But even cases and things like, I like to pick on this, and I teach a course in sustainable aviation, and I say, oh, by the numbers, specific energy and energy density, there are systems out there that look like they could be really appealing. Take this diborane case, right? And if you don't know what diborane is, you can go look it up on Wikipedia, and you'll probably very quickly realize why we don't use it as an energy carrier for aviation. It basically is, hazardous to any living thing. It will spontaneously combust, right? And so, just in practice, it's we have to look beyond the numbers and think about what are the actual cases and places where we can safely, at high capacity, economically, and in a technologically feasible fashion, develop a system for energy, and liquid hydrogen is one that does that. And I put this here, right? This is also a report that many of you might be familiar with that actually comes from the Department of Defense Aircraft Mobility Command that has looked into hydrogen. And they've ultimately concluded that there are, not necessarily, and there's a whole kind of suite of these comparisons between JP8 and hydrogen, JP8 being very consistent with Jet A. And effectively, it's not even so much that hydrogen is inherently better or worse than traditional kerosene jet fuels. It's just different. You have to think about very different things. There are cases and places where JP8 is actually not advantageous to use, for instance. So it's less about saying that one is better than the other. It's more about saying both are feasible, right? But you need to think about different things whenever it comes to actually developing and integrating. Of course, right, I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss and kind of conclude some of the environmental benefits of running with hydrogen as an energy carrier. So what this chart shows is in today's day and age, whenever we combust aviation turbine fuel, so jet A1 or A kerosene, and we combust it with air, right, we end up with a whole bunch of direct emissions, whether it be CO2 or nitrogen oxides or soot or water vapor, right? There's a whole complex series of microphysics within the atmosphere of reactions that occur that, you won't find in other modes of transportation because, gas turbine engines have much larger overall pressure ratios as compared to, other conventional combustion systems that use piston technologies. So, for instance, we get more NOx emissions, but also things like aviation-induced cloudiness. You're not going to find aviation-induced cloudiness produced by a locomotive, right? Because it's not at the cases and altitude considerations where ice supersaturated conditions form. But ultimately, this leads to impacts to climate as well as damages in the form of social and welfare costs. So when we consider hydrogen, right, and I now look at the emission products, right, I'm eliminating the vast majority of these emission products. I'm left with nitrogen oxides, which, and again, there's a whole suite of technologies being developed to limit the emission of nitrogen oxides from hydrogen combustion engines. And especially as we look at lean and micromix approaches, you can dramatically reduce the nitrogen oxide emissions. Of course, the water vapor emissions go up. And ultimately, one of the key things that is keeping a lot of people up at night is what is the impact on aviation-induced cloudiness or contrails? Since you do not have nucleation sites in the form of soot particles that are emitted from the engines any longer, how important is engine oil or maybe ambient aerosols already out there? I've seen plenty of studies that consider, oh, well, you're going to get far worse impacts of contrails, as well as one that say you will have much less impactful contrail formation processes, so it's actually better. This is an important question that people are still grappling with, but I'm going to kind of wave over those for the day just for now. So the direct emissions of hydrogen aircraft as compared to kerosene, we are expecting that there is going to be a dramatic reduction overall in the climate impact of these types of aircraft configurations. You can see the emission indices, right, of a handful of different kerosene and hydrogen cases as inspired from the literature. And effectively, what an emission index is that, as I burn some mass of fuel, whether it be kerosene or hydrogen, so 1 kilogram, I have an emission of some similar mass, right, of this other quantity. And then the global warming potential, or GWP, I can take that, mass of the emission, whether it be NOx, whether it be water vapor, whether it be even just fugitive losses of hydrogen across my supply chain. There's going to be some CO2 equivalent of climate forcing that is produced. And we, of course, have these at various confidence level. We understand CO2 very, very well. But we're still working on understanding certain cases where, NOx emissions at high altitudes have more complex interactions with the atmosphere. And so this could be a really important thing moving forward for hydrogen, is to say, how do we actually get to low NOx engines? Because everything else absent or created equal, if you just combusted hydrogen using conventional combustor technologies, you might end up having actually tremendous increases in the NOx emissions that these hydrogen engines produce. So lots to untangle there. And I guess what I'll mention is that, and as we launch into kind of thinking about the system level considerations on the supply side, what needs to happen in the energy landscape, I'll note first and foremost that we've been here before. And part of the reason why I'm not focusing so much on the, hydrogen aircraft technologies at the moment is simply because we kind of already know that we can do this. Not to say that it's an easy problem, right? But, even 24 years ago in the EU cryoplane study, this is a quote of, the use of liquid hydrogen is technically feasible, and it would greatly reduce the environmental impact of aviation without affecting safety. If we start from that point, right, we might say, well, what were the missing pieces? It's been 24 years, and 2050 is also 24 years from now. Why is it that this didn't really take off in the fashion that, the cryoplane study said that it could? And the missing pieces there were really about what's the availability and what's the economic competitiveness. Notably, economic competitiveness is one of the barriers, right, that thus far has hindered hydrogen and hydrogen economies in aviation of being something that businesses can work with. So as we look at kind of, again, this renewed interest in, the overhaul and transition to a hydrogen system for aviation, what can we expect within the next 24 years? Will it be any different? That's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to pose this with a handful of driving questions. So by 2050, what will aviation look like? How many airplanes will there be? How far will we fly? How much fuel will we use? Second, how is fuel produced across the landscape of petroleum jet A, of sustainable aviation fuel or synthetic aviation fuels, um, liquid hydrogen? What's the overall cycle implications? Third, will there be enough hydrogen to supply to support aviation applications? Fourth, how much will it cost? Fifth, what kind of infrastructure overhaul do we need and how much does it actually cost? And finally, is this actually realistic, right? Can hydrogen aviation be a reality at scale? So I won't spoil the surprise. We'll wait for it. So first and foremost, what will aviation look like? Well, this chart shows ever since the 60s, the dawn of the jet age, right? The fuel efficiency of aircraft, so here in orange, and some projections, right, into the future in the kind of open circles, just based on some simple kind of extrapolations. So 2% per year improvement in overall fuel efficiency is assumed, which is consistent with roughly the past 2 decades of developments. We also have the revenue passenger kilometers here in tens of trillions of kilometers per year. So those are the green squares. We of course have something happened in 2020. I don't know if you remember it. I That whole time frame for me is just a haze for whatever reason. But we of course had a dip in overall flight activity. So RPKs are just basically a person traveling 1 kilometer, right? But I multiply that by on an airplane, right? I multiply that by the total number of passengers on an aircraft and the whole total distance, and integrate that across a whole annual cycle. That's my revenue passenger kilometers of flight activity. This doubles more or less every 15 to 20 years. And so we're assuming a similar RPK growth of 3.6% per year, which is consistent with what a lot of kind of market forecasts in the sector. But if you're paying attention here, what you'll notice is that because this value of RPK growth is growing faster than this value, the 2% per year, of fuel efficiency improvements, we end up actually having an increase in the overall emissions, right? That we can expect in a business as usual scenario, right? Because there's a whole Jevons paradox thing that I can get into as to how kind of efficiency and emissions or energy use are linked. I'll save that for another day, but just we're outpacing in the popularity of flight activity over the actual emissions improvements that we're seeing. And what this ultimately boils down to, and really what we're interested within the context of this study here, is how much energy should we expect aviation to require, right, by this future 2030, 2040, and 2050 timescale. And so taking all this into account, we can expect just over about 20 exajoules per year is what aviation would need to meet the market demand. You can see that, again, because this is a crystal ball approach, nothing is for certain in the future. We've kind of compared this to a handful of other forecasts. So the ICAO LTAG medium forecast here assumes a little bit more of a bullish market for aviation. But we're kind of sitting in the middle of some other studies and other forecasts that were done by a few other groups as well. So that's about the amount of energy that we're thinking we might need in the future. Now the next question is, well, what about airplanes, right? What kinds of airplanes do we think will be comprising the global fleets? And so we've similarly made market projections of how many narrow body, wide body, and regional jet aircraft do we expect there to be into the future. This is inspired by, and the paper has more details on this, a handful of different market forecasts from Oliver Wyman as well as Boeing and ICAO. And really important to take away here is to say that as we go from, our current day and age all the way to 2050, I can't snap my fingers and just have transport class aircraft in service immediately, right? There's a whole overturning of the fleets that happens over time. And as we look at, for instance, answering the question of, well, how many hydrogen aircraft do we think practically could be in the global fleets by the year 2050? It's not going to be 100%. Right? Especially if, the first entry into service is not till maybe the late 2030s to early 2040s. Right now we're assuming that by the year 2050, maybe about 25% of transport class aircraft are hydrogen, most of those being regional jets and narrow bodies. And just to kind of show this a little bit further, right? What we see even in today's day and age is that about 58% of current aircraft entered service more than 10 years ago. So we really only have, every decade, we're not even covering half of the overall fleets of aircraft. So if we're not starting till, let's say, 2040, that's only the size of this wedge that we have to play with as far as hydrogen aviation is concerned. So with that in mind, if we look into the future, right now we've got a whole lot of aircraft that can function great using just plain Jet A. If we consider 100% SAF compatible aircraft, they will likely enter service reasonably quickly, owing to some of the engineering challenges of 100% SAF compatibility that are solvable. And then here we've got the hydrogen cases where principally these are regional jets as well as some narrow body aircraft that we're anticipating maybe a few wide body airplanes, depending on when those aircraft would enter service as well. But about 25% of those global fleets. So second, how is fuel produced? So for this, and I will gloss over this. There's a lot here. If I'm just being completely transparent about this, a lot of cases where we need to just take information from a whole variety of sectors and synthesize it together in order to make these conclusions about how much fuel is available, what the climate impacts and emissions look like, all that kind of good stuff. So we're considering four different classes of energy carriers. The baseline petroleum Jet A, we dig it out of the ground, we refine it, it gets to the airport, we go. We've got, of course, biojet synthetic kerosene, which is effectively kind of the traditional SAF that many of you are thinking of, whether it be HEFA processes, hydroprocess esters and fatty acids that use cooking oils or, palm oil or, all sorts of camelina oil. And then take those long hydrocarbon chains and slice them up into the compatible, kerosene C carbon lengths. And then we, of course, have power to liquid synthetic kerosenes. And in biojet, we're also assuming alcohol to jet. I forgot to mention that. Power to liquid synthetic kerosenes that use hydrogen as a direct feedstock, and then liquid hydrogen. And I like this. This is just a bit of an aside, but here's all the different flavors of SAF. And I like the apples and oranges question to say how similar is it to existing petroleum Jet A? Is it apples to apples? Is it apples to different colored apples or apples to bananas? Right. So there you have it. First and foremost, if we're bookkeeping the energy and emission impacts of petroleum Jet A production, this one is very well understood. So here is effectively, just a comparison of the life cycle implications associated different regions of the planet, right, where you might be producing jet fuel. Yes, it does make a mild difference. But lo and behold, this 89 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule that the ICAO CORSIA baseline uses is roughly, about right. So we just use that kind of moving forward throughout the rest of this study. If we're creating SAF, the next question is, of course, and we want to compare and understand, how much hydrogen is needed for power to liquid, or, what are the climate impacts. It helps if we know what the production volumes are and the selected pathways that you're going to be using to produce those SAF fuels. So in the next, handful of years, it's still likely going to be dominated by the HEFA processes. These are where we use oils and greases. Not so much power to liquid. By the year 2050, a lot of folks are predicting that, HEFA will start to kind of decline. We'll get more use of advanced feedstocks through ligocellulosic kind of biomasses for ethanol to jet. But power to liquid ultimately will start to become a lion's share. We base these on kind of meta study of a whole bunch of different roadmaps. And so this helps us to say, whenever I create a pathway mix, how much am I assuming is power to liquid? How much am I assuming is HEFA? But even within those, it does matter what feedstocks are we using and where those feedstocks grown, right? Whenever it comes to HEFA and ethanol to jet. And here you can see kind of on the life cycle analysis basis, we almost have kind of, again, these meta, pathways in pathways types of things. We've got the pathway mix that says, various HEFA processes, various ethanol to jet process, various power to liquid. And even within the context of those, if you zoom in, you'll see this where we've got, pathways that consist of various feedstocks. And this is then the punchline of what we can expect. So for HEFA and for things like power to liquid, the power to liquid approach, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the life cycle implications of hydrogen production because it is used as a feedstock here. We're assuming that low carbon hydrogen production will continue to increase as we get to that 2050 timeline. I also did effectively all these life cycle assessments using the Argonne GREET tool. So more information on that later if folks are interested. But this is kind of where we're landing, is that if I take the whole blend of these pathway mixes, we're down to about 30 something gram CO2 equivalent per megajoule by the time we get to 2050. Now on to hydrogen. So there's of course this hydrogen is the most plentiful molecule in the entire universe, and so there's like countless ways to create it. Of course, many of you are probably familiar with kind of this rainbow of colors of hydrogen production. Ultimately, what we're trying to get to is green hydrogen production, maybe pink hydrogen production, white hydrogen production in terms of naturally occurring hydrogen would be really phenomenal as a bridge to grow the hydrogen economy in meaningful ways. But each pathway, of course, has its own, climate impacts on a life cycle basis. So there's ways that it would actually be very counterproductive to the climate to just take the jump right now with some of these different means of producing hydrogen that utilize heavy reliance on fossil fuels without abatement. Um, but as it comes to asking the question of how do we think that hydrogen might be produced by the year 2050, we rely on some data that exists from IEA, which is a great kind of global reference point of things like what volumes of low carbon production growth can we expect, as well as even all the way to regional distribution to say what resources exist in different parts of the planet for hydrogen production. So in North America, we might have a good penetration of blue hydrogen initially. So the pie chart on the left-hand side is the 2030 kind of split of hydrogen production. The one on the right being 2050. Also in Eurasia, we might expect a lot of blue hydrogen in kind of the longevity. In Europe, lots of grid hydrogen as well as green hydrogen, and so on and so forth. So what we see is that today we have primarily gray hydrogen production, which is of no surprise. But as we look to the next decades, growth of blue hydrogen production, and then a real big uptick in green hydrogen production being something that we expect to see. Um, Also, since I did mention grid hydrogen, it of course does matter where does the electricity come from, right? So we did an entire life cycle assessment to say, using the electricity generation globally that is anticipated from IEA, what is the total kind of climate impacts of just this, mix of what the grid across a global landscape might look like in an aggregated sense. Of course, we see that things like coal start to sunset. We have, natural gas starts to sunset, but be replaced by kind of fossil fuels with carbon capture, and the growth of renewables quite a bit. So all of the different then values that go into the hydrogen specific steps like liquefaction, which of course is necessary for aviation, electrolyzer efficiency is baked into this, as well as other CO2 sequestration percentages across some of these blue hydrogen production pathways. We end up having also grid emissions in effectively what the 2030, 2040, and 2050 mixes of these grids looks like. So, like I said, kind of complex system of systems, right, that are all interacting. And the punchline of what kind of emissions would look like for hydrogen production under the scenario looks something like this, where if I was to go out today and use the existing gray hydrogen production pathway, as well as, technologies for liquefaction that really, are a ripe opportunity for us to improve, since a lot of the liquefaction technologies are, more energy efficient, less energy efficient than, really it's like I said, a piece of low-hanging fruit for future development. We can get all the way down to below 20, grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule of this production process. And so this is the 2050 Sankey diagram of what liquid hydrogen versus power to liquid SAF would look like. For liquid hydrogen in 2050, I might need roughly 1.5 megajoules to create 1 megajoule of fuel. Versus power to liquid SAF, I would need probably closer to 1.9 megajoules to create 1 kilojoule of jet in the end. Just more steps. The more times you handle the molecule, right, the less energy efficient you are overall. So then this is the summary, right? And once I kind of rope in some of the aviation specific emission products, right, this is what I get. And what I should also mention is that we've made some, very broad strokes assumptions about, again, things like how does the low NOx emission technology behave for these engines. I've assumed fugitive losses around, a shrinking amount, but, around 3% at the end of the day by the time that we get to 2050, starting from about 9%. Hydrogen emissions into the atmosphere do have, while not a direct greenhouse gas, it promotes various reactions that do things like increase the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere. So we want to make sure that we're accounting for all those different nuances as well. So that's how fuel is produced in kind of this projection to 2050 and the overall kind of climate implications of these different fuel pathways. So next question, will there be enough hydrogen supply to support aviation applications? And the short answer is maybe, right? But the longer answer is we created roadmaps for this as well that were based on kind of a similar meta-analysis of various roadmaps that were developed by other stakeholders. So if we look at today's hydrogen production, most of it being used to support chemical development, largely ammonia for agriculture, but also refining and other kind of things like that. And we might start to see a permeation into bigger energy markets, right? There's going to be a tremendous amount of growth that is necessary in the production volumes of hydrogen globally. This being said, this is the total production of hydrogen globally across all sectors. We're expecting maybe 400 megatons per year. Some, of course, we're kind of in the middle of the road, right, compared to some of these different roadmaps. But one of the big questions here is to say, if aviation could use all of that hydrogen, great, right? We'd have zero problems at all. But the fact of the matter is that aviation is a proportionally small stakeholder overall in what, and this is a plot taken from IEA. And so with that in mind, aviation currently does not really have any, place within the landscape of hydrogen use. By maybe the year 2030, you start to see the presence of that. And then, that grows further into 2050, where maybe aviation would occupy about 13 or so percent of all global use of hydrogen. But we can't just go on an underlying assumption that, hydrogen is produced globally and aviation somehow has use of it. It is a commodity that many people will clamor to utilize. And so we need to be cognizant of that as well. So with that in mind, if we kind of take this projection in mind and we say, all right, here's the total hydrogen production globally that we've kind of estimated using our forecasting, and we just assume like a linear increase in the aviation share up to that 13% that I mentioned, the total hydrogen energy available for aviation here on the left is just over 6 exajoules per year. Now, the big question is, right, what about power to liquid SAF and liquid hydrogen, direct use and reconstruction into a kerosene? There's maybe enough hydrogen by the year 2050, according to the scenario, to support direct liquid hydrogen use. But the big question is going to be, how does that dovetail with the power to liquid SAF use scenario? And this is one where we have some projections. I have not included them here simply because it's really difficult to say kind of how these two systems are going to interact. Hypothetically, right, if we need just around 20 exajoules per year and for all of aviation activity, and we have, let's even say 25% of that would be necessary for liquid hydrogen aircraft, even though we wouldn't really need that much simply because the regional jets and narrow bodies don't use as much energy as the wide bodies do. We would have enough if there was not over competition within the landscape of power to liquid SAF development. So that's kind of the punchline, is that it depends type of scenario, but in all likelihood, yes, we would have enough. So with that in mind, with the do we have enough? Yes, asterisk, right? I'll say, well, is it going to be competitive? Because this is a very, very important question. And so, spoiler alert, right? The cost competitiveness of hydrogen will depend tremendously on how it's produced, how the efficiency of some of these different electrolyzers and other systems mature over time, the degree to which we can leverage natural resources that exist. So you see some hotspots where, for instance, oil and gas can be utilized in a blue hydrogen production context. But the cost for manufacturing is going to be variable globally. So this is, again, something that I thought was a very illustrative diagram that the IEA developed, and I just figured I'd plug in here. So how did we estimate the cost anticipated for liquid hydrogen use in aviation? Well, it began with taking a meta-analysis again of data from the literature. There is a paper out there that is phenomenal, this one from Frieden and Lecker, where they actually have done extracted a wealth of different independent individual studies out in the scientific literature that consider what is the cost of hydrogen production, across all technologies, all market sectors, all places in the world. And we've basically taken a handful of those and a total then of 637 individual cost projections. Each of those 637 constitutes one of these symbols in these kind of array of stacked, points, and taken the median gaseous production costs as our assumed values here. We thought that the median would be more representative than the mean, simply because we end up having clustering down in certain areas that is indicative of a more likely kind of outcome. We also then have to incorporate things like liquefaction electricity, and so we take the actual electricity load and use future forecasts of electricity costs within the landscape of developing the liquefaction electricity contributions to the cost forecast. And we also then include distribution and fueling stations. Note that these estimates here in the table are substantially lower than what you'd see in kind of an automotive context. There's some great work that's out there that kind of looks at cost forecasting and cost estimation for liquid hydrogen utilization within the landscape of, you pull off the highway to a station, right, that is small. The fact that we're centralizing a lot of these volumes of liquid hydrogen distribution to airports, and airports really are energy hubs in this landscape and context. You can do this distribution and fueling process a lot less expensively than you would in a highly distributed type of infrastructure setup. So our kind of distribution and fueling station requirements or costs are estimated to be quite a bit lower. So that's one of the things you'll see that is different from some of the other automotive and the like. But what we're looking at, and this $7.14 cost of kind of current values is actually pretty consistent with liquid hydrogen delivered costs that you might see out there today. And we're expecting that as we look and compare, kind of the near term 2030, this is where we get our biggest jump. We see consistency with the 2030 Hydrogen Council estimates. And then we see a bit of a plateau. But by the year we reach 2050, this is again liquid hydrogen delivered cost, right, to an airplane. It might be as low as $3.37 per kilogram. Now, how does that stack up relative to today's energy consumption? What this looks like, and this is just basically a plot showing the cost of jet fuel, right, across the previous handful of decades. What we see is that, and this ends at 2025, but if I were to plot it up today, I don't know if anyone's out there reading the news, right? Oil and gas costs and the markets are really not in such great shape right now for a whole variety of reasons that I will not talk about here today. But we do see that if I take on a per energy basis, right? So here's my per energy basis cost of liquid hydrogen in dollars per megajoule, and I compare that to the dollars per megajoule cost of jet fuel, right? I find that I end up actually having pretty decent parity in cost by this 2050 timeframe. But I also want to highlight one other thing too, which is to say that I just mentioned this volatility that exists in some of these oil and gas markets. Because of this, right, if you are relying on let's say, green or pink source of hydrogen that is renewable, or zero carbon in this context, you will find that the cost is going to be a lot more predictable. And so you're going to end up with a little bit less volatility in those. We see this actually today in electricity costs globally, is that, you get seasonal fluctuations and variations, and it grows as a function of inflation. But it really doesn't have these, tremendous large peaks and valleys like we see over here. So that can be really appealing for certainty because, again, economically, sometimes having certainty in what future costs might look like is just as important as saying, how do I bring the cost down? So with that in mind, preaching to the choir here, right? What kind of infrastructure overhaul is needed? This is a big undertaking. and how much does it cost? Is that cost realistic? So I really like how the London Heathrow Airport put this together in what they call Project Napkin. So I've kind of taken it here, but doing this in stages where we would have, let's say, first and foremost, a what we call an all-in-one truck, where I bring fuel in, liquid hydrogen fuel in on a truck, and the truck also serves as the tank, right, that you're using to fuel airplanes. So it sits there at the airport. You can fuel from it directly. There's no independent distribution mechanism at the airport itself. In the midterm developments, right, having on-site storage where trucks come in, right, they fill up the tanks, right, and then there's also dedicated Bowsers or refueling trucks at the airport specifically that are utilized in order to refuel the airplanes. This is maybe where some of the regional jet aircraft, right, you're going to want to have a dedicated fuel farm that you can utilize. And then longer term, so 2050 era, let's say, there is a massive benefit to having on-site liquefiers and piping in gaseous hydrogen that you can liquefy on-site from the overall life cycle impacts of this system. Having then a pipeline and hydrant system will allow dramatic improvements in throughput. Right now, of course, one of the things that keeps us awake at night when it comes to hydrogen aviation is how long does it take to refuel the airplane? You need to have an on-site pipeline and hydrant system like what we have today for kerosene systems at major airports in order to really meet that throughput requirement. It's just too much fuel to move otherwise using a tremendous number of individual Bowsers and refueling trucks. So here's an example of some things that you would need under that landscape. So again, we've got, hydrogen storage tanks for liquid hydrogen, fuel farms that look a lot like what we use in space launch systems today. We would need pipelines that can do things like have, outgoing liquid hydrogen fuel across this that is pumped through to the gates, as well as gaseous return lines for the boil off, as well as inerting lines and, maybe some sort of helium gas inertion process. As well as, digging trenches and putting in these pipelines across, these airports. These are some classic studies maybe some of you are quite familiar with. But having other safety measures, I like this Lake O'Hare, as someone who flies through O'Hare a lot, where if all else fails and you can't reuse the gaseous hydrogen, you just go and safely terminate it by burning it, right? So outside of a conflicted airspace region. But how much would this all cost? So largely the World Economic Forum and McKinsey at one point did a study on this, and they similarly assumed about a 25% of all new aircraft would be supported with liquid hydrogen. They said somewhere in the ballpark of 600 billion to 1.66 trillion dollars. And interestingly enough, this value is actually commensurate roughly with what you would need for doing an entire overhaul of the energy system just for SAF itself. This is a lot of money, right? And they also forecast the overall cost on a per airport basis that you would need in order to support an international hub or like a large regional airport or even like smaller regional airports as well. It's quite unlikely that you would be utilizing right away these hydrant systems. Even, I fly out of a regional airport quite often at Champaign Airport. They don't have, right? They use fuel trucks. So with that in mind, getting these types of on-site Bowsers would be really great for those types of airports. But whenever I fly to Chicago O'Hare, really at one point you're going to have to rip the Band-Aid off and put on-site liquefaction and hydrant support. That being said, the lion's share of the cost of this whole transition scenario is not the Bowsers, the liquefiers, although liquefiers are very expensive, and the hydrants. It is just in the production process of the fuel, right? Scaling up the global production of hydrogen itself using a whole variety of technologies and capabilities, electrolyzers, that type of stuff. That's where about 90% of the overall cost for this whole system comes into play. Even though the costs are sobering for the on-airport systems, it's still only about 10% of the total cost of this process, right? It's really kind of the energy fuel production and processing costs that we need to support. If I wanted to get to 100% support, it might be upwards of about $7 trillion, simply because of the fact that even if supporting 25% of the global fleets, which are smaller aircraft, right, there's a broader increase in the overall energy production that is needed once I get to the larger wide body aircraft as well. So just keep that in mind. And now to the reality check. I've done a lot of this, like I said, kind of crystal ball scenario development. Anyone can make up a number, although I like to think that these are based on technically credible sources that, yes, are going to want prioritization of sustainable and renewable technologies in power and energy. But let's talk about this. There's this ongoing idea also that, because of the way that hydrogen integrates with high volume, that it inherently makes the airplanes less efficient. We've been studying hydrogen aircraft design now for probably almost a decade, right, within my research team at the University of Illinois. And what I will tell you is that I actually like to say that there are ways that you can make hydrogen integration more efficient, right, than what you get out of traditional aircraft designs. One of which, of course, is in fuel cells, right? So we've done studies on integrated propulsion systems that are 100% hydrogen electric. And compared to turbofan cases, you get more bang for your buck out of the fuel. It's plain and simple with a lot of these. And yes, the IPS integrated propulsion system does include, the influence that the tank has, the influence that the boil off has, the influence that the heat exchanger system has, the influence that the variable power sensitive efficiency of the fuel cell itself is, right? Lower efficiency at takeoff, higher efficiency at cruise, all that stuff. So yes, you can make an integrated fuel cell propulsion system to be more efficient than that of a turbofan quite easily. Um, we also see that whenever it comes down to it, right, making airplanes that are larger, right, and cover longer cruise distances, they can close at the multiple thousands of nautical mile landscape. This is something, again, that we're doing in the NASA ACES project right now, Jet Zero and Company. If we look at global fleets and how we've seen this reduction in overall fuel requirements by both propulsion technologies and airframe operations, we see that we're starting to hit this point where um, they're starting to match the best in class. So these two lines here are for improvements made since the 1990s in global fleets, not the best in class airplanes. The best in class airplanes are down here. If we extrapolate this down to 2040 and 2050, the gray symbols here that are open are, concept aircraft from the ICAO LTAG report. Our systems fit just in line with the best of the best, right? So these concepts that we've been working towards certainly are still maintaining the efficiency that you're looking for in an aircraft for transportation purposes. What happens if things pan out differently, though? So again, I mentioned that my arm was twisted, and we did this whole thing with the Progress in Aerospace Sciences editor, and he said, "Well, I want to know, lay out three different scenarios. So one, which is, of course, the kind of current state of the art, but then three future scenarios, one of which is the nominal scenario that I've been talking to this whole time, right? The high impact of hydrogen in reducing emissions, as well as the impact of SAF in reducing emissions by this 2050 timeframe, as well as compared to a business as usual approach, which is here. So this is basically just hydrogen doesn't happen because everyone is, ultra conservative, and we have limited penetration of SAF fuels, really no hydrogen aircraft by the year 2050. And we have an all hands on deck case down here where it's that we do make the rapid improvements in the technologies, we do close these aircraft designs, we do field them to market very rapidly, and we have basically large penetration of hydrogen aircraft in this all hands on deck scenario. Um, and so I like to lay out this case of an all hands on deck scenario as a thought experiment that is compelling, right? Because the question is it even technically possible for this all hands on deck scenario to be, realized? And that will inform kind of our nominal scenario a little bit. Is this a reality check that we need to go back and revisit? Turns out that multi-trillion-dollar investment requirement that I've referenced, so the 1.66 or all the way down to maybe $0.6 trillion infrastructure cost. If we took that cost of 1.2 trillion, so maybe like an average of the two, and amortized them across 10 years, it's about 0.1% of global GDP. Is there enough money in the world? The answer is yeah, there is. And how do I know that? As well, aviation, as we all know here, right, actually has a catalytic process that helps global economies. So aviation activity supports about 3.9% of global GDP. So what I'm suggesting is, can we take a fraction of that? You could even amortize this not across 10 years, but a longer time frame, right? But it's a small price to pay in the global GDP context, which is easy for me to say as an academic. This is again where plug into the policy bits plays a big role. The other reality check here is if I take this all hands on deck approach and I say, well, you told us earlier that you can't just flip a switch and introduce brand new aircraft into the transport system. And I say I agree, but is it technically possible? Well, what I'll say is that we maximized the number of deliveries of regional jet all the way to wide body aircraft in 2018 when there were 1,729 aircraft produced per year. But in an existential, I guess I'll say, context, we've been here before. In the 1940s, right, this of course being driven by World War II, the United States alone produced around 300,000 new airplanes within a 5-year period. And, you might say, well, those airplanes are different than what we fly today. And I say, I agree. But also about 30,000 of those were heavy or very heavy bombers that have inherent characteristics of how the aircraft are configured that meet the same wingspan and takeoff weights as conventional transport aircraft. And so as a consequence, if there was some existential external forcing, and I don't mean to be too kind of dramatic about this, it's technically possible, right, to produce those volumes of aircraft to do a rapid turnover of the fleets. So with all that being said, right, I'm going to end it there. Is to say this is, of course, like just a wacky idea of one guy who is thinking, is this overhaul possible? What is a technically credible approach that, yes, is admittedly bullish, but does not have any showstoppers? How do we now go from this vision of this blueprint of what needs to happen and start executing and putting it into practice? So that's where I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity to share this vision, and an opportunity also to chat with many of you in the context of what we go and do from here. And by all means, if any of you are interested, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to chat anytime. Contact information is here, and happy to take questions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Philip. That I would say 99% of that was stuff I'd never seen. So I'm hugely grateful for that. I just want to make a couple of comments. And I have questions. I'm going to jump off the questions and then we'll let other people ask their questions. Albert, I do see your hand up as well. I'm glad that you mentioned 1,000 and some change aircraft produced in 2018. One thing I think is so important that a lot of us don't appreciate is how small mass production for aviation actually is. As somebody that came out of manufacturing, we don't do like automotive. We were making like 30 aircraft a year, and we were the largest manufacturer in the U.S. So, but then to your point about World War II, so in Wichita, Kansas, manufacturing central, it was really cool because in the basement there were sort of like some graveyards of just where all the old World War II manufacturing used to be. And it went on for miles and miles, and you'd have to bring a flashlight because there wasn't really good lighting. But the amount of history, and I always just exactly what you're saying, though, I've seen the remnants of that, of where we did that in person. And it is possible. It's where Rosie the Riveter came from in World War II. And if we're looking at, not to be fear mongering or anything, but if you look at the drone industry and how we've outsourced a lot of that, batteries and the manufacturing of drones, if the United States doesn't get back to this, and if it isn't a motivator from climate, then war will get us there, unfortunately. But either way, we have to get back into producing those amounts that we did in World War II. We're just going to have to as a country. So I'm glad that you included that. Next comment I want to say is I'm also glad that you included SAF. A lot of people think of, SAF, is it going to be SAF versus hydrogen? And we really believe at HYSKY that it's all of the above, and that SAF is a precursor to, it helps enable the use of hydrogen. Hence why HYSKY is also doing a course with AIAA on SAF, because it's, a critical enabler for hydrogen. And then the last thing, I just have a question and then I'm going to shut up, but I struggled to understand, simply because I just haven't had time to really look at it. But could you explain to me, like I'm 10, what is the difference between power to liquid SAF and then just using liquid hydrogen as a fuel. I just don't really understand what that means.
Yeah, good question. Um, if I can also just rewind to the previous comment that you just made, I'm just going to go on out on a limb and do it anyway.
Yeah.
Going rogue is I fully agree, and there's cases and places where, as we look at liquid hydrogen, if I go out and do it today, it's actually counterproductive, right? The emissions are higher than what you get for just burning petroleum kerosene. So we need to be playing a long game, and that does involve, yes, pairing some of the developments with the SAF industry, which is great. I mean, and there's creative ways that I think we can share a lot of those developments such that we don't have this sunken cost fallacy that, if I invest in, let's say, SAF development, it's somehow now too short-sighted and it is never going to be leveraged in the far-term future. There's actually really compelling ways that you can take biomass and extract hydrogen from it. You can produce hydrogen using biomass. It's just carbon rich and hydrogen poor. But if you extract it using, let's say, some sort of gasifier, you now have carbon and hydrogen in high concentrations together. You can pull out the hydrogen, and there's all sorts of stuff you can do with the carbon. You can sequester it. It's very difficult to extract, do physical carbon removals from the atmosphere. But if I'm using biogenic feedstocks as a means for producing hydrogen, I now can start doing that because I have everything bottled up nice and tightly, lots of carbon. I could put it somewhere. Um, so there's ways that you can go, for instance, and we like to talk about power liquid versus hydrogen, where we invest in hydrogen development for both, yes, but I also think that we can invest in biogenic sourcing for energy and also go the hydrogen route that most people only think of as a SAF specific item. Um, so there's lots of benefits and kind of ways that these systems can play with each other, which to then the question of power to liquid SAF and hydrogen. And I have a 7-year-old, so I can maybe talk like I'm
Hey,
talking to her.
yes, that's
So
exactly what I need.
yeah. So what we do, and I actually communicate this way in my class. So there are three major ways that you can produce SAF. The first one is the HEFA process that many of you are probably familiar with. Fats, oils, and greases. They tend to have longer hydrocarbon chains than those of kerosene. Kerosene has a carbon number between typically like 8 to 16. So there's 8 carbon atoms in a molecule of this organic compound, right? But what I can do is chemical engineers are magic, and the facilities they can set up are amazing. I could take those longer hydrocarbon chains and slice them up, right? Hydrocrack them to the right length that matches that C8 to C16 chain length. When it comes to alcohol to jet, it's the opposite problem where they tend to have shorter hydrocarbon chain lengths. So what I do is I put them through these catalytic plants that build up and gosh, what's the term? Oligomerize to build up to the right chain length of 8 to 16. I do more or less the same thing with power to liquid SAF, except I'm starting with a carbon number of 1 in carbon dioxide, right? And so I'm effectively creating the catalytic chemistry in the plants such that I'm taking just H2 and CO and I smash them together, right? That's the technical term I use is you smash them together using this thing called the Fischer-Tropsch process. Um, which you can use to create hydrocarbons of various chain lengths. So the careful balance you need to play with these power to liquid SAF plants is you want to try to target a sweet spot, and you put in series of hydrocrackers and recirculators to try to target that 8 to 16 carbon chain length. But it's all a chemical process that takes just the H2 and the carbon and makes, you know, something like a C10H22.
Mhm. Okay,
It's all in
I
the
see.
chemistry. It's amazing.
Okay. Okay. So it's just in the chemistry. Well, I
Yeah.
would love to hear your daughter talk about hydro cracking and C8 change. It's amazing. I'm gonna have okay, the first question that I saw, I'm just gonna go in
Into it.
order. And Albert, I do see your hand, but before um you go, I would like to remember who asked it. Somebody asked about solid state hydrogen. I'm trying to find who it was. If Okay, it was Rich Holloman. And Rich,
Mhm.
you're welcome to unmute and ask your question if you're still on, or I can just ask it if Rich doesn't come on. So Rich asked, how does solid state hydrogen fit into your future aviation
Mhm.
vision?
It's a good question. We've looked at various forms of solid state hydrogen. So like a lot of metal hydrides, for instance, and as a carrier that you can then release. We've looked even at at solid state hydrogen at just extreme low temperatures, as well as slush hydrogen. And the challenge that we find is really in many respects, I think that there are maybe niche applications where solid state hydrogen could be compelling. Um, Whenever we ran kind of a trade study in some of our recent work for, and the lens that I'm kind of approaching for this is you really need to have a very aggressively lightweight and compact storage system. And notably on the gravimetric efficiency, um, just we haven't found that there's a reason not to go for a physical state of just H2, right?
Hmm.
That yeah, I mean, there might be some cases where you start looking at like lithium hydrides and stuff, and they might look kind of appealing, but then you need all the water reaction systems to be on board. And, we can produce a much lighter hydrogen storage system and a smaller hydrogen storage system in just pure liquid form. And so we figured, why
Hmm.
not? You know,
Yeah.
um, we know that we can develop these systems in a safe way and handle them across the supply chain. We've probably driven past a liquid hydrogen truck on the highway and not known it, for instance.
Hmm.
Um, but it's just a question of, it's already right there.
Yeah.
So that's my maybe dodge of an answer, but there might be some applications for kind of solid state. I just haven't really dug into them.
Yeah. Interesting. I like that answer. Okay, Albert, you're up. And then let's be mindful of time because we've got 11 minutes and I want to get to as many questions as we can.
Just a quick comment about the solid state hydrogen.
Hmm.
The energetics are not favorable. I'll just say that. Uh,
Hmm.
Phil, I want to commend you for handling such a complicated subject, and you did so much remarkable. Okay.
Thank you.
I am struck by that last picture of yours, which shows a hypothetical aircraft, and
Uh-huh.
to how close you put the engines to the fuselage. And of course, you have that in slide 45, as well as in many slides we've seen of
Uh-huh.
from Airbus and the like. And in the mid 90s, I forewarned about the design of the Concorde before the accident happened.
Hmm.
You don't want the engine so close to the fuselage. There is a good reason why in commercial aircraft it's on the wing and far
Hmm.
away, because engine fires are very common.
Yes.
And it's much more forgiving if you're not close
Hmm.
to the fuselage. And in the Concorde case, it was actually embedded in the back, internal almost, to
Hmm.
reduce drag for a supersonic aircraft. So why do people feel such urgency to show it that way?
Hmm. Yeah. And this is a really great comment. And engine placement, I guess I'll say specifically for hydrogen aircraft, there is, I think, an underappreciation for, I mean, the engine placement is one thing that you can, discuss and that is a key consideration. But even the tank placement is something that I see as being underappreciated. Ways that even if you were to look at today's, CFR Part 25s in, for instance, the US, and we have existing, I don't remember the exact part of that, airworthiness requirements that we have under our CFR. But even with today's existing kerosene systems, fuel is dictated as you have to design your fuel system and storage system in such a way that is A, inherently prevents vapor from entering any cabin, right? That basically more or less eliminates any storage underneath passenger decks, right? Just because hydrogen is slippery if you do that, then you're almost guaranteed to have already, right, not met that requirement. You also need to have the current storage systems basically guarantee that they won't catch fire if you end up having FOD kicked up or some other penetration of the tank. And I look a lot of these that kind of have, maybe tail strike challenges or cases where landing gear failures could puncture a tank and lead to a fire. So there's already a lot of kind of cases where in existing airworthiness regulations that we already know, everyone keeps saying, well, what's the hydrogen, regulation going to look like? And I'm like, it's not going to get any easier. So let's at least start by meeting what we have. What I'll say, and I don't want to like defend, for instance, these specific configurations, because they are really just cartoons, but we have looked to, and we did this a lot in Cheetah. Um, we've been mostly concerned about the um, rotor disc burst condition, the compressor burst or fan blade off scenario, and basically drew the wedge such that those fan blade off considerations would not lead to any penetration or puncture of the tanks. Um, what I'll say about, for instance, like this one, this is supposedly a full hydrogen fuel cell electric regional jet application. The jury's still somewhat out on what the considerations you'd need in terms of placement and deconflicting with the cabins. For some of these, I know that this is somewhat inspired also by like the D8 aircraft that the placement of the engines, it didn't have these other two engines, and so there was some criticism of, okay, well, a lot of fratricide challenges of one engine goes out and it hits the other one. I don't have answers to most of those things, but maybe this does tell me that we should be thinking maybe a little bit more purposefully about the engine placement. So that the consideration here is duly noted.
Okay, sounds good. So
Mhm.
good luck. It's a tough one.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Vadim, you're up.
Excellent presentation, Phil. It's always a pleasure listening to you. I also recommended to all my colleagues to read that paper, which is a background for your presentation today in progress in aerospace sciences. One question which I have is, that slide which you just had displayed with, three types of aircrafts, and with fuel cell versus turbine efficiency. That brings up a question. A lot of studies which you have shown, they are on fleets for the future. But those relationships on let's say like on efficiency of turbine versus fuel cell, they also depend on the type and size of the aircraft, and that's exactly what you are showing at the bottom.
Mhm.
Like any comments on what, let's say, what was, let's say, your measuring stick? What was your starting point? Did you consider 737 and just walked from there, or or maybe there were some other approaches? Because it's really, when we're talking about air vehicles, there is a very significant diversity in types and sizes of air vehicles, missions, and all of that. Thank
Yeah.
you, Phil.
Absolutely. No, this is a really good question. Um, and I guess what I will say is we have, whenever I laid these out, the only version of these that is purely fuel cell hydrogen electric is this one. And this is again like an Imagineering context, where given that I'm an academic, I like to just think about what is like the best thing we could do with maybe in perhaps an incorrect way. I've kind of just forgotten about all the things that you'd have to set up for supply chain and tooling and all that stuff for a very different configuration. But I've also assumed this one, which is I think a parallel electric hydrogen gas turbine engine, which is a little bit more of a conventional thought around hybridization. Um, Whereas this one, I'm assuming that we're going to want to make it more gas turbine engine than we will want to make it fuel cell. But to the point of this other high two pass program that I kind of hinted at, that we're going to be releasing some more content around at aviation. There's actually, I think, a really compelling way that by having the fuel cell system work in conjunction with the gas turbine to make the gas turbine functionally adaptive, what you can effectively do is bring the gas turbine thermal efficiency up to the efficiency limit of the fuel cell, more or less, in a fully hypothetical sense. And so my vision, my opinion, and I haven't run the full parametric sweep here to make this conclusively, but my suspicion here is that you'll see a point where actually a fuel cell gas turbine hybrid gives you the best of both worlds for this longest haul and largest capacity aircraft. So this one is supposedly like 120 passengers. This one's closer to maybe 180 to 200. This one is, 260 to 300. And yes, you're absolutely right that I do perceive, like others, that there's likely going to need to be differences in how we look at the power system architecture as we consider the rest of the vehicle integration components. Um, we also have a paper that is coming out soon that starts to look at this from just a purely integrated propulsion system like this, right? But with projections into, future fuel cell technology capabilities, there's some that, just owing to the nature of conventional aircraft architectures, it's quite unlikely that we'll be able to make a stretched 777 to meet the same mission capabilities. We need to then do things like change the power and energy, the power plant, to maybe not just be pure fuel cell, but also change the overall aircraft topography. So maybe going to something that is more tolerant of volume increases. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of my outlook on it. I fully agree that that's the size and class of aircraft have a great deal of are very important to consider when it comes to um, detailing fuel cell versus gas turbine variants, or again, hybrid.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more. Sarah, I know you had a few questions. And I apologize, I had to skip a few, but I really like this question that you asked about the stuff happening in Iran. And I don't see your question immediately, but think that would be a good one. And then I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes and we can chat about some of the other questions. But Phil, you do not have to stay. Um, sorry, it wasn't Sarah. It was Sergey or Sergey. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, but please
Oh,
ask that question.
fantastic presentation, Philip.
Thank you.
How do you assess the potential impact of the wars in Iran and Ukraine on the development of hydrogen technologies?
That's a good question. One of the things that whenever I showed here's the fun fact, right? Whenever I showed let me go back and share again. I just like seeing you all before I answer the question. So, whenever I went to, oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. It is this chart. Fun fact is that this point right here in jet fuel cost, its peak was produced at the initial invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The way that these types of events destabilize kind of this all sorts of global systems, um, the uncertainty that produces is certainly something that is underappreciated. And so I haven't actually looked at what the current prices for, jet fuel costs are. I could go into to see what those things look like. And it would be fascinating to look at how now the current, war with Iran, how that changes things. Um, so I think that it comes down to a few different considerations these events pose. The first is there are strategic reasons to make a nation or nation state fully, um, uh, let's say more tolerant of these disruptions. Um, of course, the hydrogen global market we anticipate will be just that, global, right? There will be those that are producers and those that are importers. But there are ways that you can stabilize, I think, a lot more of these markets. And so, from a strategic standpoint, you will likely see that happening. On, let's say, maybe the less about the markets and strategy around infrastructure and maybe more to specific systems. Um, we are already seeing a wealth of ways that conflict has changed the roles that aviation serves, notably in the use of uncrewed aircraft and the things that those uncrewed aircraft can do. Um, there are, and we've got some programs that we're in discussion right now and in proposal for with various defense stakeholders that hydrogen can serve a role there. And so I do fully believe that if your goal is to have uncrewed aircraft that can go and fly missions of long duration, go and fly missions where you're untethered from refueling infrastructure and operational energy, there are ways that it might be that those help to facilitate initial use that can dovetail into civilian use. So I know I'm being somewhat vague, and I apologize for that. But I think that there is a real opportunity, but what will happen, I really don't know. It's a little too uncertain for me to say exactly how the Ukraine invasion and the war with Iran right now, what role those will have, if any.
Thank you,
So,
Philip. Thank
sure,
you.
certainly.
And I think Phil, we're thinking the same thing. My comment earlier, no way am I insinuating that war is good or there are winners in war. There just aren't. Um, but there is a need for high altitude, high endurance aircraft. And so that's why I was mentioning the China thing. We've sort of lost that chance to compete with battery powered drones, right? But with hydrogen, there presents an opportunity where it could be a strategic advantage in a war, which could also give a country a chance to be a little bit like less dependent on what we have access to in terms of fossil fuels. We could take that advantage to manufacture aircraft and create less dependent energy systems as a country. So I think we're sort of saying the same thing. There are loads of questions, but I think we should end there. And there's one more if you want to do one more. There is one that I really liked.
Sure.
Okay, Rich. I don't know if you're here, but Rich asked if you could comment on the power source for producing hydrogen at an airport, for
Mhm.
example, at an airport or near an airport with at the airport hubs, or, for example, nuclear.
Yes. Oh, this is a good question. And I'm not going to pull up the slides because I have something else that I like to reference. So
Mm.
if you haven't noticed yet, I like to do these kind of just thought experiments of um, if I snap my fingers and I make a change, what does that change look like? And the energy requirements of fueling aircraft at major airport hubs is so much more substantial than I think most people realize. To the point where we did a program where we were looking at Chicago O'Hare as a case study to just say, okay, what would it take to fully electrify Chicago O'Hare or produce hydrogen for Chicago O'Hare for aviation activities? And the amount of energy dispensed in all of the jet fuel that, for all of the departures, all of the landings and refueling processes, um, it would require more or less 24/7 operation of, if memory serves me correctly, about 6 gigawatts of power. The largest nuclear power plant globally is 8 gigawatts, and a more typical load of a nuclear power plant somewhere between like 2 to 3. So we're talking we need multiple nuclear power plants running 24/7 to meet the fueling requirements that we see in the dispensed fuel energy. So energy per unit time, right, of fuel that goes into airplanes. So with that in mind, yes, absolutely. I think that if you have a dedicated power source, um, you could go with something that is highly consolidated, like a nuclear that has a very small land footprint and match the like to like. When it comes to energy, airports are just that, right? It's just a consolidated energy hub versus the highly distributed case of rail and road and those types of approaches. So nuclear has many compelling cases there. The downside to it is just the cost. It tends to be costlier than right now the cheapest way to produce energy or power, electrical power, is just solar. And so there you'd have to distribute it. I'm actually, I think, a bigger fan of finding ways that aviation can plug into other hydrogen production ecosystems that do not require a specific, centralized hub for the hydrogen production. Just because I think that there's synergies that we can leverage maybe a little bit more constructively. But yes, if you were to try to do something like a power production next door, nuclear is a great option. I'm a big fan of that.
Thank you so much. Wow, I have so many questions I want to ask though. To be continued. I'm so happy that we were able to have you. Thank you so much. This was a massive contribution to the hydrogen aviation community. So thank you so very much. And just want to remind everybody that tomorrow we have our strategy meeting. HYSKY is volunteer ran. So if you're interested in leveraging our community, come to our strategy meetings. We meet for 1 hour every other Tuesday. So if you're curious about that, shoot me an email. I'll send you an invite. Thank you so much again, Phil. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. Don't get pinched tomorrow. And have a great rest of your week.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.